When Jimin walked onto the stage at a major global music awards show, just days after the passing of a legendary producer who had inspired generations, the audience expected something simple: a calm reflection, a few diplomatic words, maybe an anecdote about BTS's future. But from the very first moment, something felt different. The host tried to keep things light, even cracking a few jokes, but Jimin didn't follow the script. He seemed distant, focused, his expression calm but serious. Then his eyes landed on something unexpected: a small golden music note pendant resting quietly on the table in front of him. In that instant, the atmosphere shifted. The questions changed, and so did the answers. What began as a casual segment turned into something else entirely: a live revelation, an unspoken confession, and a truth that had been hidden in silence for years. When the last words were spoken, the audience didn't applaud. They realized they were witnessing something much greater. Jimin was breaking years of silence on live television after a secret encounter with the legendary producer, an encounter that could change everything we thought we knew about music, inspiration, and the power of legacy. Before continuing, let us know in the comments, what do you admire most about Jimin and BTS? The studio lights flickered briefly before settling, the LEDs reflecting off the expectant faces of the crowd, buzzing with excitement for the night's special guest. On any other occasion, it would have been just another awards show, just another speech among global stars. But tonight was different, not just because the world was still processing the loss of a music icon. The host, with his polished smile, projected his voice across the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, BTS's Jimin!" Thunderous applause erupted in the auditorium. Some fans stood up, others, despite strict security, discreetly raised their phones to record the moment. Jimin entered with slow, silent steps, dressed in a flawless black suit, no tie, his hair a little longer than usual, his expression polite but distant. The host reached out and Jimin shook his hand softly. They sat across from each other. On the table, a glass of water, a stack of question cards, and most curiously, the small golden pendant resting on a dark blue velvet cushion. "Jimin," the host began, trying to keep things light. "What unique times we live in, right? The world has lost a legend, but you still look almost immortal. What's your secret? Holy water?" The audience let out a brief laugh, but Jimin only managed a slight smile, saying nothing, his gaze fixed on the pendant, not just glancing, but as if something deep was holding him there. The pause, awkward at first, grew heavier. The crowd felt the change and the whispers stopped. "Are you all right?" the host asked, laughing nervously. "You seem even calmer than usual tonight." Jimin took a deep breath, reached out, and touched the pendant with his fingertips. His eyes lost focus, as if falling into a buried memory. "He told me something that night in Seoul," Jimin finally voiced, son, his voice calm but low, almost as if speaking to himself. "Something no one has ever heard." The host leaned in, intrigued. The audience was absolutely silent. And maybe tonight was the time to share it. The studio froze for a moment. No one knew if this was part of the script or some masterful piece of showmanship. But Jimin was not acting. There was no trace of performance in Jimin's face. He wasn't acting. "Share what?" the host asked, trying to regain control of the moment. Jimin looked at him, but at the same time seemed to look right through him. "What he entrusted to me," Jimin said quietly. "What he didn't want to take with him to the grave." The audience remained absolutely still. The host shot a nervous glance at the backstage crew, but no message came through his earpiece. Jimin wasn't there to promote his image or to entertain. He was there to speak the truth. Years earlier, Jimin began, his voice soft but unwavering. "I received an invitation that didn't feel real." He shifted in his seat, the golden pendant still resting on the table in front of him. "I was in Florence," he continued, working on a small, very personal musical project. One night at the hotel, someone knocked at my door. They didn't say their name. They simply handed me an envelope, sealed with a mark I recognized, the symbol of the legendary producer. The audience held its breath. Inside was an invitation. It wasn't official, it wasn't for business, it was handwritten, personal. He wanted me to walk with him, just in silence, among the olive trees. No cameras, no media, just us. The room fell into a reverent, almost sacred silence. "And did you go?" the host asked in a hushed voice. Jimin nodded. "Of course I went. I thought maybe he knew something, or perhaps he wanted some support, maybe even a donation. I didn't know, but what I found was much deeper." He paused. A dense silence filled the studio. "I was taken in a simple car to a side entrance of his estate. The night was cold. An older man greeted me. We walked through a maze of corridor and gardens until, under an ancient olive tree, he was waiting for me." Jimin paused briefly, then continued. "He looked tired, so thin, but his eyes were more alive than anything I've ever seen." The host stayed silent, listening intently, as did the entire audience. "He started talking right away," Jimin went on. "He told me he had seen footage of me visiting children's hospitals quietly, without cameras, that silent gesture spoke louder than any award speech." Jimin took a deep breath and added, "He confessed that he felt as if music itself, the soul of music, had been silent with him for years." His words hit the studio like stones. A chill swept the room. He spoke about the burden of carrying a legacy, about the anguish of representing something so much greater than oneself, and yet feeling utterly alone. He said he prayed, but the skies felt mute. Jimin looked directly at the crowd. His eyes were urgent. "Faith survives silence," he told me. But he feared that one day faith would start to imitate it. "And what did you say?" the host now asked, his tone much more serious. "Nothing," Jimin replied. "I didn't say a word. I just listened." Then slowly Jimin pulled an envelope from his pocket. It was sealed with deep red wax. "He told me," Jimin said, sitting up and repeating the words exactly, "if we never see each other again, this secret must live on." The words echoed like an invisible bell through the room. "Did you open the envelope that night?" the host asked. As the tension grew, Jimin shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I kept it for years. But now that he's gone, I don't know if I can keep this secret any longer." The studio was so silent it felt as if time itself had stopped. Even the usual hum of the technical crew seemed to vanish. The host sat frozen, barely breathing. Jimin leaned forward, eyes fixed on the small golden pendant. "I carried that envelope with me for years," he said. "It traveled with me to every country, every concert, every hotel. I never opened it. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place." He looked up. "But when I heard he had died, something inside me changed." With slow, almost reverent movements, Jimin reached inside his jacket and pulled out an envelope, aged by time, still sealed with deep red wax and the mark of the legendary producer. The audience shifted in their seats, the tension so thick it felt like a physical force. Are you going to open it now?" the host asked, his voice tight. Jimin didn't respond right away. Instead, he held the envelope up for the cameras, saying nothing. He broke the seal. The soft sound thundered through the silent studio. With steady hands, he unfolded the letter and began to read aloud. "To the man of silence, who listens more than he speaks and sees more than he shows. This world does not need more idols or more gold. It needs people who will carry light through the shadows cast by those meant to protect it." The paper trembled slightly in Jimin's hands, not from fear, but from reverence. "I write this with a heart torn between duty and despair. For years, I fought behind marble walls. I wore the crown of success while I swam in a sea of secrets." Jimin paused, swallowing hard. "There are forces within this industry I could never cleanse. They wear the badges of music on their chests, but they move like wolves. I tried to expose them. I failed." The host opened his mouth to speak, but thought better of it and stayed silent. "And now, if my voice is silenced, I ask you, a stranger to the politics of my world, to carry this truth, not to destroy, but to preserve what is still beating." Jimin lifted his gaze from the paper. At the end of the letter, there was more. He unfolded a second page, his eyes narrowing and his voice lowering to a whisper. "It was a vision," he said, "a prophecy." A ripple ran through the crowd as the host leaned even closer. The producer had written, "The one who undoes me will not come from within. He will smile, dress as a friend, but bring emptiness. A collective chill ran through the audience. The host stared, stunned. He believed, Jimin continued slowly, that the downfall of music's spirit would not come from open betrayal, but from imitation, from someone who appeared pure, but brought only emptiness. The silence that followed was absolute. I didn't understand it at the time, Jimin added, but after reading that letter, everything changed. What do you mean? The host finally managed, barely daring to break the silence. Jimin looked at him intently. I started to study, in silence, music, power, silence itself. I didn't speak to anyone. I wanted to understand what he was trying to tell me. There was a heavy pause. And then the messages began to arrive. Who? The host whispered now. Jimin looked straight into the camera. Anonymous letters, warnings, all connected to him, all telling me never to reveal what I knew. Jimin held the second page from the envelope in both hands, as if its weight was much greater than just paper. He looked up, scanning the studio. Then Jimin turned slightly toward the audience. This part, he said softly, I've never read out loud to anyone, not even the team behind the cameras. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Jimin read again, the one who undoes me will not come from within. He will smile, dress as a friend, but bring emptiness. A hushed murmur swept through the studio like wind through dry leaves. The host remained motionless, as if even a sigh might break the spell. Jimin slowly folded the letter and placed it next to the golden pendant. He believed, Jimin continued quietly, that someone outside of the music world, would appear, not as an enemy, but as an empty mirror, and this person would gain influence by imitating kindness, only to hollow it all out from within. Finally, the host broke the silence. He thought this was already happening? Jimin nodded slowly. He told me, the soul of the world is no longer crumbling because of the truth, it's starving because of illusions. The host shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing aside as if waiting for a signal to cut to commercial. But none came, no one dared to interrupt. He also said, Jimin went on, that maybe the next great step for music and for art wouldn't be taken by the industry itself. The words hung in the air, disturbing, prophetic. Do you mean someone else would continue his mission? The host asked. Jimin didn't answer right away. He looked again at the pendant on the table. He believed that music and faith both had to evolve, but he was afraid they'd be manipulated before they could blossom. The audience held absolute silence. No one coughed. No one moved. It wasn't just interest, it was a shared gravity, as if something irreversible was being revealed. The host tried to lighten the moment. Jimin, you're talking about enormous things. Music, power, legacy, maybe even prophecy. Maybe we should take a break? No, Jimin said, his voice not loud but definite. This isn't just a story, it's a warning, and there's more. The host leaned back in his chair, uncertain what to say. Jimin continued, his voice calm but steady. After that night, I went home. I didn't speak of it, not even to my closest friends. He reached down to a portfolio beside his chair and took out a sheet of paper, aged but not as much as the letter from before. A year later, Jimin said quietly, I received a letter. No return address, no name. It was just slipped under my hotel room door. He held the sheet up for everyone to see. No official seal, just a typewritten message on yellowed paper. He read aloud, do not open the envelope. There are forces watching you. He was surrounded. You are not yet. The shadows remain. Silence protects more than you imagine. The host leaned in, the tension rising again. That sounds like a threat. Jimin nodded. That was the first. Then came 6 more over the next 4 years, all from different places, all in different handwriting, but all with the same message. Don't reveal what you know. Did you think they came from inside the industry? The host asked. At first, yes, Jimin admitted. But over time, I started connecting the dots. He placed the letter on the table. Jimin continued, his voice lower now. There were more than just letters. Over time, I started hearing about artists who tried to change the industry, people who disappeared, journalists who went missing after investigating the hidden finances of major labels. Marginal notes found in old, locked-away lyric books. Patterns. Warnings. The host opened his mouth, but closed it again, not knowing what to say. Jimin went on even more quietly. I found a name, or rather a phrase. It kept appearing in several old documents, written in Latin. He looked directly at the camera. Sin nomine. A chill swept through the room. It means without a name, Jimin explained. It's not an organization, it's not a group. It's a belief, a silent, hidden network formed by those who no longer trust the industry, but who still believe in music. The host whispered, "Do you think the producer trusted them?" Jimin slowly shook his head. No, he didn't trust them, but he knew they might become necessary. He knew the industry, as it was, wouldn't survive what was coming. A deep silence followed, so thick it could almost be felt. Then Jimin said something that changed everything. That's when I realized the producer didn't choose me by accident. The host stared at him. What do you mean? Jimin's eyes darkened, not with fear, but with memory. He saw something in me, something I hadn't even seen in myself, not until the dream. He let his gaze rest on the audience for a few seconds, then leaned forward and pulled out another sheet from his portfolio, more worn but more recent. This note, Jimin said softly, came just weeks before he died. No return address, just a folded piece of paper slipped under my hotel door. He held it up for all to see. No seal, no signature, just a typewritten message on old paper. He read aloud, "You are surrounded. If you open the envelope, there will be consequences. Silence protects more than you know." The audience shifted uneasily. The host blinked rapidly, visibly unsettled. I didn't know what to think, Jimin admitted, but the letters kept coming. Each one different, each one urgent, but always the same message in different words. Stay silent. Did you try to find out who sent them? The host asked. Jimin nodded. Yes, I hired private investigators, contacted sources in Europe, but nothing. No fingerprints, no security camera footage. Whoever sent them knew exactly what they were doing. He took out a slim folder and opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings, scribbled notes, photographs. He laid a few on the table. At first, I thought I was imagining things. You know how paranoia works. Sometimes you see patterns where there are none. He picked up a photograph, a young smiling artist. This was Matteo, Jimin explained. He ran youth music programs in Palermo. He openly criticized financial corruption in the industry. He disappeared on his way to Seoul. Another clipping, a headline in Italian. Journalist found dead in Tiber River. She was investigating shady real estate ties between labels and shell companies in South America, Jimin said. They called it a suicide, but 2 days before she had published a damning expose. The host could no longer hide his discomfort. Jimin, this is a lot to take in. But Jimin pressed on, his voice unwavering. And then I found something else. Notes hidden inside old lyric books. They weren't online, not cataloged anywhere. They were handwritten, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in symbols. He slid one of the notes across the table. Jimin slid the note across the table. On it was a rough drawing of an eye, and beneath it, 3 words. Es nomen vivid, sin nombre vive. The nameless lives, Jimin translated. Again and again in the margins of forgotten lyrics and journals, he had found these words. The host reached for his glass of water, but didn't drink. The audience was absolutely still. Then Jimin said something even more unsettling. I realized something far more disturbing, he whispered. The producer didn't just see something in me. He saw someone like them. Someone who moves quietly. Someone no one would expect to carry something sacred. He closed the folder and he looked at the host. He didn't choose me despite being outside the industry. He chose me because of it. The host was silent, processing every word. Finally, he asked cautiously, but why you? Jimin leaned back, his eyes clouded with memories of what happened after the dream. The dream you mentioned earlier? The host asked. Jimin nodded slowly. Yes, the night I opened the envelope, I had a dream. Or maybe it was something more. He glanced at the audience as if searching for each person among the shadows. I was in a massive, abandoned concert hall. Everything was covered in dust. There were no lights, No music, only silence. A shiver went through the crowd. And at the altar, Jimin continued, he was there, the producer, standing and waiting for me. The host whispered, "What did he say?" Jimin closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, filled with something larger than fear. He said, "You thought you would only be a leader, but I saw the one who carries silence with dignity." The audience exhaled, a collective sigh, not of fear, but of awe. "I woke up," Jimin went on, shaking, sweating. I had never felt anything like it. Since that night, I was never the same. The host stared at him in amazement. "Do you think he knew he was going to die?" Jimin took a few seconds before answering, his voice barely a murmur. He wasn't afraid to die. He was afraid to die for nothing. The weight of his words seemed to crush the very air in the studio. Jimin turned slowly back to the table and took out something else. "And that's why tonight, live in front of all of you, I'm going to show you something that was never meant to be seen." A wave of silence swept over the studio. The host dared not speak. The audience did not move. Jimin was no longer simply an artist. He had become a messenger of something deeper. He took a deep breath and said, "That dream was unlike anything I've ever experienced. It didn't feel like a normal dream. It didn't seem like imagination. It felt placed in my mind." He rested both hands on the table. I was in an enormous, empty concert hall. The silence vibrated in my chest. Dust floated in the shafts of light. Each step echoed like thunder. I didn't know where I was, but it felt both sacred and abandoned. He paused, his voice steady but softer. At the altar, he was waiting for me, the producer, but not as I remembered him. He wasn't sick. He was serene, almost radiant. The host, hypnotized, leaned in even closer. "What did he say?" Jimin looked out over the audience as if speaking directly to each person present. "He told me, you thought you'd only be a leader with convictions, but you've always been more. You carry silence like a cloak. You carry it with dignity." Jimin paused. "He told me that the industry was drowning in its own echo, that the true voice of music had been buried under centuries of noise, and that only someone who understood the value of silence could hear it again." The host swallowed hard. "Do you think it was really him?" he asked. Jimin lowered his head for a moment, deep in thought. "I don't know what to believe," he admitted softly, "but it changed me forever. Since that night, my life was never the same. I stopped working as much. I buried myself in music theory, in philosophy, even in mystical and apocryphal texts, trying to understand what he really wanted from me." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, battered notebook. "I started writing every night," Jimin explained. "Thoughts, symbols, questions. Sometimes I feel like it isn't even me who's writing." The host, now visibly affected, asked quietly, "Are you afraid?" Jimin paused before answering. "For a long time, yes, but now I think fear was only the first test." He looked again at the golden pendant on the table. "He told me something else in that dream," Jimin added, just before the dream ended. The host waited, expectant. "Your silence will be a door," he said, "but you must decide. Will you let others walk through, or will you keep it closed forever?" A long silence fell over the studio. The host looked around, clearly overwhelmed. "This isn't what I expected when I sat down here tonight," he said. Jimin smiled for the first time in several minutes. Not a warm smile, but a tired, almost pained one. "It wasn't what I expected when I walked through that door either." "So why now?" the host asked. "Why share all this live on television?" Jimin looked directly at the camera. "Because the truth is quieter than lies. And if I don't say it now, I may never have another chance." He leaned back slightly. "And because there's something I need to show you." The host hesitated. "Is it dangerous?" "Maybe," Jimin replied. "But what scares me more is what might happen if I don't show it." He opened his folder again and took out something small and rectangular from among the papers. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of the inevitable. The host leaned in even more. "What is it?" Jimin held the object face down. "It's a photograph," he said, "from that night, a private moment that someone captured." The audience held their breath. "It's an image of me and the producer in the garden, Jimin said, turning the photo over, but not yet showing it to the cameras. But there's something else in it, he added, his voice heavy with gravity. The host asked, his voice breaking, "What?" Jimin looked down at the image. A hooded figure in the background, barely visible. He placed the photo face up on the table, angled so only the host could see. This figure, Jimin continued, appears in 3 other images I've received over the years. Always watching, always hidden. The host whispered, "Who is it?" Jimin looked up. "I don't know." He paused for a long moment. "But the producer warned me in my dream, you'll see the shadow before you see the light." He extended the photo for the host to examine more closely. Look carefully. Behind the trees, a hooded figure just watching. The host squinted, unsettled. "It could be anyone," he murmured. "Maybe," Jimin admitted, "but this same figure appears in 3 more photos, from different places, different moments, always distant, always observing." He took out the other photos, blocking the cameras from seeing them. "The last words the producer spoke to me were," Jimin recalled softly, "you'll see the shadow before you see the light." The host fell silent. "It's not a threat," Jimin added. "It's a warning, something is coming. And it won't be the industry that faces it, it will be us." He stood, ready to leave. "Music isn't dead," he said as he walked toward the curtain. "It's waiting. And silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's the beginning of a war." Just before he disappeared backstage, he turned to the audience. "And if you think it ends here," he said, pausing intensely, "wait, because what comes next is even worse."